Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to show you the techniques that I usually use to create pixel art portraits, and this is a sort of a simplified approach to it. And this one is in real time, so you get to see me work at the speed that I usually do. So this is a 15 minute sort of process, and it's not that much time consuming if you kind of have a plan, if you know where you're going with design and if you know where you're going with your shading techniques. And this is what I want to show you here. So here I'm picking my colors for the skin tones right off the bat. These two are the same, but I'm going to change one of them, and I create the dark tone and the mid tone, and then I'm going to add the brighter one. I'm going to do, of course, a sort of a lighter skin tone, just because that's what I'm mostly used to doing. And I want to take the colors away from the yellow tones. Even if you're doing a dark skin tone, you still want to have some red saturation in it, because there's still blood vessels underneath the skin. This one thing that we usually did in the past was to add the background color inside of the color swatch, just to see how it bounced off against a contrasting background color that was too bright for the shade. So what I do is I create these big circles of color, and this is because I'm doing a sort of a cartoony approach. At a certain point in the image, you'll find like, okay, this is cartoon enough, no, it's fine. But if you keep adding more and more information, the less it becomes cartoon, because you're adding more information, you're reducing the simplification, you're making it more complex. So what I did was a 34 pixel circle with a 30 pixel circle underneath, and then I'm making a 32 pixel circle in the bright shade. There we go. And then a 28 pixel circle at the bottom. And what that do is that'll carve a nice inner shape and inner shade of that sort of peanut silhouette that I'm working on. I'm cleaning up some of the sort of the double pixels here on the corners. To me, this is kind of the way to go when it comes to outlining. There's a few things you can add to this. I'm gonna do some selective outlining, and I think I'm gonna do a little bit example of anti-aliasing. Now for the mouth, I usually just start with a line and the positioning of the mouth and the face element. So in this case, I add a couple of dots here just for the eyes, a 3x3 square. And if we move it up, right, we get a completely different look than if we move it down. This is more childish, and depending on where you're gonna draw the hair, this can look like a young person. But usually the eyes, usually stay at halfway the height of the face. Even if you're doing sort of anime or some stylized style, there's usually that sort of rule of thumb that the eyes usually stay at the center of the head's height, right, midway up down up to bottom. So now I have sort of made up my mind that this is where I want my elements to be, and I want to make sure that I draw them cartoony. So here's an example of the technique that I usually do when it's not cartoony, which is to draw the shadow shape. And this is reminiscent. This is not exactly like, of course, I've never been classically trained, but this is reminiscent of what people do in live drawing, where they draw the coarse shadow and they figure out where's the lights and darks. And you can see that very quickly you create the impression of a face just by adding shadows to a skin tone, or in this case to whatever color. If you're doing this in grayscale, if people know that you're drawing a face, they will immediately recognize that that's a cast shadow from the nose, and that that's a cast shadow from the eyebrow, and that you're doing a sort of more, not realistic, but more towards based on the real world interpretation of that. What we want to do is a cartoon form. So the cartoon form doesn't really draw what you see, it draws more what you know, right? So if you know that the nose has this shape, you're going to draw it regardless of the nose looking that way in the real world when you're looking at someone, right? I'm also here drawing. So here's the thing with the eyes. For the eyes to look left or right, you have to add more whites to one of the sides. The problem with the eye on the left, so the character's right eye, is that it's too thin. If I make it double thickness, this is just weird. He's just looking weird. But if I make it double thickness, it means he's looking way to the right. So what we do is we shorten this eye. And by shortening it, we also have to move it further close to the silhouette. And what this does is it sort of places the eye in a perspective that we know the face has. We know that the face is a spherical surface, more or less, right? The eyes and the eyebrows sort of wrap around the skull. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, the way that I added the eyebrows here, for some reason, it kind of went like, oh, this was just a generic face, and now I seem to feel that this is more like a female face, and I think it's not because of the eyebrows itself, it's just because the eyebrows actually turn the dark lines above the eye into eyelashes, which are dark and thick, so it's probably reminiscent of makeup, which is more common with women. And I think here I'm just sort of putting layers together. Yeah, I think I'm just separating the background, right? So I'm also carving a little bit more shape into the face, and I think here I'm going to add more of a straight jaw, because just the sort of the peanut silhouette that we had earlier isn't really enough to create like a proper face. And I'm also not really enjoying the amount of 45-degree lines that I'm getting, right? So here I'm trying to fix that by just breaking that 45-degree line into a more rounded shape, which again is more natural in organic things rather than man-made things, which are more prone to having straight lines and square angles and whatnot. So the face itself right now only has two shades, right? There's the bright skin tone shade, and there's the mid-tone, which I'm using for the lines. And because that's just it, there's no range for me to sort of play around with shading that much. Also, here I add an ear, and I think it's just really sort of to place myself. I think the ear should be way more to the side and seen a lot more from the front than almost from the side, which is what I'm doing it here. But again, this is cartoon. It's a stylization, so we're drawing what we know. We're not really drawing what we are seeing right in front of us or anything like that. And it also is just an opportunity to draw an ear, which is something that is not very common if you're drawing characters with long hair or hats that cover the ears. A lot of people tend to run away from ears. I think the hierarchy is hands, ears, and then maybe shoes, I think, as people try to avoid a draw. So here I'm taking the darkest tone and I'm going in over the same lines that I had before with that darker tone to create some sort of depth, or at least some sort of visual hierarchy, by saying this is more important than this, right? And what we have here is just this little pixel here on the corner of the mouse just makes the character smile a little bit more, because it suggests that the corners of the mouth are pushed in. And if you want to make him laugh, just paint that line white, and it'll look like it's a small, really small grin. Also, I like to add darker tones to my outlines where there's room for it. So if there's a lot of same color line, I will go in and add a little bit of color. And this is, in this case in particular, because we can do the opposite. Here I'm adding a little bit of anti-aliasing, but it's something that you don't want to be worrying about at this stage. You don't want to really do anti-aliasing right now, because if you have to change the outline, there's a lot of pixels that you have to change. The other form that people use, and that is usually called selective outlining, which is really selective outlining, is to just make sure that this looks good if it was fading to black. So whenever there's a step in your outline, you try to get that step to look a little bit darker. And selective outlining isn't really specifically about a certain rule how to do outlines. It's more about be mindful of your outline. Be aware of your character is going to be. Also, adding this darker tone allows me to take now that outline color and use that as a cast shadow color, right? And that means that the face now can have a lot more volume than it had before. I can do a shadow underneath the eyebrow, which I previously didn't really have a way to do unless I wanted to blend things together like I did earlier in the image. I can add this shadow underneath the lip, and I can carve a little bit more silhouette of the face, both on the left and also here a little bit on the right. Now, this sort of bony structure is more common in men, so already I'm deviating from what I initially considered to be a more female face. It also changed the nose a little bit, but the nose again is still very cartoony, very stylized, so there's really no rule here to determine whether or not the nose is correct, because in this reality it is. I'm also adding another darker tone just because I really want to make some contrast in the eyes and the eyebrows. And it also will allow, again, for me to come in and do a little bit more shading in some of the parts. Now, here's if you want to go crazy, okay? I'm going to do this and I'm going to get rid of it because I think it's a little too excessive. But this is how you make a character older, right? You can add bags under the eyes, shadows under the eyes, which means that the skin is going to be a little bit older. The muscles are going to be sort of losing their tenacity, so they're going to be folding down a little bit more. But if you really want to get a lot of bang for your buck, you draw the shadows above the mouth. That's what really makes your character look really old. That's someone who's been talking a lot their whole life. And this is something that I sort of stumble upon almost accidentally, because you can have a young person with lines under their eyes, and that's actually going to make them more joyful, almost like they're always smiling. But if you add the wrinkles underneath the nose, and if there's no other way for you to identify the person's age, that's going to show you or tell you that that person is not 12 years old, you know. Here I'm adding the shadow on the right side of the character's head, so on our left side. And because I made that whole dark mass of color, I can now take that sort of darker skin tone and use that as an outline. And I can also carve a little bit of shape in between the eyes. I'm not really sure. I love doing this in characters because it makes them look sort of angry and be like they're really thinking really hard. But it also kind of makes them older, because if there's nothing else on the expression to show that they're thinking, it just looks like it's wrinkles, right? It just looks like it's them being old. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do for the highlight. This is also something that is very optional. And what I do is I take a brighter tone, which in this case is almost white, and I paint the places where I think highlights will be, right? And where I think highlights will be is basically based off of experience, right? Of looking at surfaces and interpreting the 3D sort of shape of that surface. So whenever there's a sphere, you know, there's going to be a highlight. Whenever there's a cylinder, you're going to be, you know, that there's going to be a straight line highlight. And if it's a boxy shape, you know that there's a plane that's going to be lit. So by doing that highlight right there, following from the nose to the corner of the mouth, I create a separation between that surface and the surface underneath the eye, and it just creates a step there. Now this is a different layer, and I can change it later, but as you can see here, I'm moving, even though I've not changed yet the shape of my character's face, I'm moving more towards the sort of the non-stylized, the more complex character design or character shading. So unless you have the time to actually spend on characters to do this, I would stay away from this kind of thing, because it takes a lot of time to actually figure out and do. So here I'm doing one of those guess the main character hairstyles, and I'm just doing this in a different layer. And the reason I'm doing this is just because I want the character to have hair, because doing hair is an art in itself, and it's not something I think I could explain in a 15-minute video. And honestly, I don't think I could explain it at all. I'm not really that good at drawing pixel art hair. I can copy it from someone else's style, but I guess that's just a way to learn, right? So what I do is I take my hairstyle and I duplicate this layer, and then I move that hairstyle down a little bit. And that's going to be the shadow of the hairstyle on the head. So I'm going to paint that hair with my dark skin tone, and then I'll crop all the pixels that are unnecessary. So I take a selection from the head, I invert the selection and delete. And now that's my shadow of the hairstyle. And I just shift it around, see what it looks best. It doesn't look, right now it doesn't really look that well, because the shape of the hair is still a flat shape because there's absolutely no shading. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the same technique as the head, and I'm picking the bright tones. Actually, what I do is I inverse the selection and make everything else darker, and it's ridiculously dark. The problem with it being ridiculously dark is that it's going to take away the contrast from the face, because the face's dark tone is the one on the eyebrows and the eyelids, right? So if my hair is darker than that, that means that those hairs are bright. So that's why I have to brighten the whole hair shape. And here I'm playing around with a hue, just, you know, wondering what would this look like if the hair was blue or green or whatever. So by bringing the lightness of the hair up to the same level as the eyebrows, you sort of blend those two together. You put them in the same image. If the hair was like really dark, but the face wasn't, something would feel wrong to the viewer. I'm also here adding a little bit more dark shades in some of the spots that I think it's possible. So for example, on the scar there, not scar, but on the fold there on the face, whenever you see a lot of room of the same color, that means that's probably a shadow or a sort of a dip in the shape. So you can add a little bit more darker pixels. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learned something. So take care, and I'll see you guys around.